Today we're going to look at more specific organs or structures in your digestive system. So we'll start with the pharynx and the esophagus. The pharynx itself is a cavity. It's basically just an opening that's behind the mouth. So it's just kind of the area, the cavity that's there. And then the esophagus is the long tube that's going to lead from your mouth to the stomach. The pharynx connects the nasal and oral cavities. So all of these deal with cavities or openings that are in your nasal oral area. So it connects the nasal and oral with the larynx, the esophagus. It's divided into three parts. Nasopharynx being closest to the nasal or nose. Oropharynx is the middle. That's going to be closest to your mouth. And then laryngopharynx is going to be closest to your larynx. So the pharynx is divided into three parts. And if I look at it, you can see, so nasopharynx is this space right here, basically leading from your nasal cavity, so it's going to be the top part. Here's your oral cavity, here's the oropharynx. So basically where my oral cavity empties into the pharynx is the oropharynx. And then the larynx, which is the cavity right here, the laryngopharynx is right behind that. So top, middle, bottom, the whole area would be considered your entire pharynx. So when you eat and swallow, steps that go with that. First thing, your food is mixed with saliva, which is very important for making it moist and starting to dissolve. That first part is called a bolus. I think I've used that term before. A bolus is basically a mixture of the food and saliva. It has a little bit of digestion of carbohydrates that's taken place. And that bolus then is going to be forced into the oropharynx with the tongue. Your tongue is very important for pushing and moving food around. Sensory receptors in the pharynx sense that food is coming into that area, and that triggers the swallowing reflex. So your soft palate, which is at the back of your mouth, and the uvula, the little flap, rise a little bit higher to block the nasal cavity so that food does not go up your nose. And then the hyoid bone and the larynx going to elevate the epiglottis, which closes off the larynx and also helps so food does not get in your lungs either. The tongue then presses against the back of your mouth, the soft palate. That seals off the oral cavity. And then muscles start to contract, pulling the entire pharynx up a little bit. The laryngopharynx is going to relax, and that's going to allow your esophagus to open. Excuse me. And the esophagus is the tube that the food needs to go to after the pharynx. Peristalsis, remember that squeeze, 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 that muscular motion begins in the pharynx, and then it's going to continue through the esophagus to move the food through. In the third stage, peristalsis continues through the esophagus, and it's going to lead food to the stomach, which will be the next organ that it will enter. The esophagus itself is a pretty much direct straight tube. That's not quite. Is a straight tube that leads down. It goes to the stomach, and then there's an opening through the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. So your esophagus goes through the diaphragm. Mucus glands are scattered throughout that submucosa layer. It's going to produce mucus, which will also help to moisten the food, lubricate the food. You don't choke, stuff doesn't get stuck. That is very important. Then the lower esophageal sphincter helps to prevent regurgitation of the stomach. So at the bottom of the esophagus, remember a sphincter muscle is a round squeezing muscle. So that sphincter muscle will close and prevent food from leaving the stomach and coming back into the esophagus. If that sphincter muscle doesn't work correctly, sometimes that can lead to heartburn, people that get heartburn. Some of the food in the stomach does come back up into the esophagus, and that's what can create heartburn. And I'll stop there for a moment.